G'day, this is David Sloan, bringing you some of the results from the 2024 demonstrations from the Water Conservation Centre at Edda. But before we dive in, I just want to set the scene. As we know, the water unfortunately is dropping off in the Texas Panhandle, but the demand for feed is increasing. So what do? How do we grow more feed with less water? We look for alternatives. And so it was decided by the Ag Committee that we wanted to include forage sorghum into the cotton-corn rotation just to have a look and see, how that compared in terms of generating feed and how it compares in terms of making money and water use efficiency. So let's dive in. At the Water Conservation Centre, there are two pivots and two SDI or subsurface drip irrigation plots. On the west side, we've got an 88-acre pivot, and on the east side, we've got a 110-acre pivot. And traditionally, those have been grown in a corn-cotton rotation where the whole pivot has been grown to either corn or cotton. But in 2024, we decided to split that and share water between corn and forage sorghum on the west side and between cotton and forage sorghum on the east side. So this gave us a really good look at sharing water with different rotations. When we look at the irrigation results, what we find is that after growing on the west circle, there was cotton there last year. So to start with, we needed over 5 inches of pre-water compared to the east pivot where we were growing it after corn, and we only needed 2.85 inches of pre-water. So there's a difference right out of the gate. And so I'm trying to look at this, be fair to an equal starting point, and compare things. I've split it between total irrigation and in-season irrigation, so we can kind of set it up from an equal starting point. And when you look at the in-season irrigation, we actually put just over 12 inches of irrigation on the forage sorghum on the west circle, and just under 12 inches of irrigation on the east circle. And that actually is because when we were sharing water with cotton, we could irrigate the sorghum in a more preferential way. Whereas when we were sharing water between sorghum and corn, we were actually looking after the corn. The corn was the primary crop. So we actually let the soil dry a little bit more, and we needed to apply slightly more irrigation on that west pivot. But as you'll see on the next slide, we actually got just slightly more yield. So it kind of evened out. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is what happened at the end of the season. And the cotton dried the soil significantly more, 10 inches compared to about 6.5 inches extracted for the other crops. So there's a 3.5 inch difference right there, and I've actually taken that into account in the results as well. So what we did, the reason we're sharing water is because as you can see, in season, there was 25.9 inches put on the corn, and when you take the pre-water into account, that's over 31 inches of irrigation. That's a lot, and it's probably going to blow through our allocation of 18 inches, which is more on the wet acres. But by sharing water, we were able to bring the whole average down for the pivot to a touch over 24 inches. So we're really close to the allocation, but when you look at that across the whole farm, it actually gets us well under the allocation, because when we were sharing water between cotton and forage sorghum, we actually only put a total of 12.7 inches of irrigation, bearing in mind that it was after corn, so there was less pre-water required. Another factor I'd like to draw your attention to, that we actually got some pretty good rainfall in season in 2024. And so with the cotton, which is it was in the ground for a much longer period, planted early, harvested late, we got over 10.5 inches, 10.7 inches of in-season rainfall, compared to the much shorter season with the forage sorghum of 7 inches of in-season rainfall and 8 inches for the corn. So there were some differences as well on the total amount of water that was available, but this was mainly due to extraction and in-season rainfall. So now that we've looked at the water use, just to recap, we've used about 12 inches on the forage sorghum, reasonably comparable across the two fields, 9 inches on the cotton. This is in season. And it was basically double, the corn used double what the forage sorghum used. It went for a longer period of time. We were carrying that through to grain, but it was just a heavier water user. So let's have a look at the yield results. So to start with, The corn got 240 bushels, which was a pretty good yield in 2024. It was actually one of the better yields for that farmer. It was harvested just slightly under the moisture content. So if you gross that up, you would have been just over 241 bushels, but we only got paid on 240, so that's what we're working on. Grain price, $5.11. And so we've used the same grain price times 10 for the forage sorghum, so $51.10. And the forage sorghum, we were sharing water with corn. We got 18.93 tons. Bearing in mind, we used just a fraction more water than on the east side, where we got 18.4 tons of silage. So very, very comparable. The cotton, it was an outstanding cotton year in 2024. Not going to lie, it got a lot of in-season rain, had a very, very long, warm finish, did outstandingly well, 1,611 pounds, where normally the average here might be around the 1,250 mark. So it was very much an up year. And so cotton price, 70 cents. So we're looking at $552 per acre. Now, all of these numbers, I should stress, heavily stress, that there is no rent taken out. This is just returns on variable costs. And I want to also stress that we've lent pretty heavily on the Texas AgriLife crop profitability calculator for 2024. That's because a lot of the costs that are associated with this trial were actually bulked with farmers' other activities. So it became impossible to unscramble the egg and split things out. But we've done it in a very indicative way using the tools that are widely available, customized for the yields and the farming practices that were done here. And so that's how we got the cost. So now let's divide through by the amount of water that it took to get there. So if we look at the in-season results, what we find is that it took about, well, we take the actual net returns, we were generating about $32 per acre inch on the forage sorghum and $34 per acre inch on the forage sorghum grown when we were sharing it with cotton. And so that's because I guess we got a slightly better return when we're sharing with cotton because it was a more compatible crop in terms of cotton, just used less water at the key times. And the cotton, what we've done is we've actually added in, the cotton depleted the soil 10 inches, whereas the other crops were 6.5. So I've added 3.5 extra inches of irrigation back to have a look at the profitability for the in-season irrigation at $43 per acre inch. But bearing in mind, that was a really, really good cotton year. So we're probably in a normal year pretty much on par with, back around the mid $30 per inch for cotton and forage sorghum. And when you compare that with corn, we're actually half that. We're at $16.32 per acre inch for the in-season rainfall. And when you look at the total returns, we're actually, around $13.92, just under $14 per acre inch on the corn, and we're way less on the forage sorghum, mainly because we had to do over 5 inches of pre-water. And the forage sorghum didn't need a whole lot of water, so it became a much bigger part of that equation compared to around $30 per acre inch return when we were both pre-watering a little bit and on the forage sorghum, and then obviously in-season irrigation. So it's pretty interesting to see just how much how much money we can generate per acre inch. And that's how how I think we all need to be thinking about this. We've got a limited amount of water. How do we actually use that to make the most money? And it's pretty interesting when we see that we've brought the total water usage. So this is including pre-water, the whole water that was pumped on this circle in 2024, 24.43. We were just a touch over 3.5 gallons per acre per minute. Slightly more water available over here on the east pivot at 3.68 gallons per acre per minute. So that might account for some of the differences in the forage sorghum as well. But there was a big difference in the total water pumped. And so you can actually do the math. You can't eat cotton. You can make money from it, but you can't eat it. So it depends whether you're trying to feed cattle or not, or feed animals, whether we need to generate the forage. But what I can tell you is that in terms of purely converting water into money, forage sorghum is right up there. It's done an incredibly good job. I did some economic analysis, and growing forage corn is definitely by far and away the most profitable. The forage definitely outweighs the grain price simply because you've got the multiplier. And of course, with corn, you get that 12-to-1 multiplier versus a 10-to-1 or a 10x multiplier with forage sorghum. So, forage corn is probably king in terms of conversion. The other thing we haven't talked about is what you need to do if you're growing forage crops. You've got to think about covering the ground again. So it's really, really important. I have not taken into account the cover cropping costs, and so you could easily add another $20 an acre for cover crop, getting that established, and then you might even have to irrigate it. So there may be some water included in that. For further analysis, you can actually read the report that's published on the North Plains Groundwater Conservation website. And I hope you consider the role forage sorghum could play in your rotation. And also I hope that you start thinking about the returns per acre inch, not just about how many inches you have.